I think today's vote at our committee meeting was sadly predictable.
They joined the Prime Minister in attempting this cover-up.
I think we all know that on the eve of an election, this kind of partisan gamesmanship by the opposition is what it exactly appears to be.
Canada's ethics watchdog will not be called to testify about his investigation into the SNC-Lavalin controversy. Earlier today, the Liberal majority on the House of Commons Ethics Committee voted down 2 motions requesting he appear before them. The opposition wanted to dig deeper into his finding last week that the Prime Minister did try and, quote, bend the will of his then Attorney General to get the SNC-Lavalin criminal trial dropped. Why did the Liberals reject the motions, and what are opposition MPs planning to do next? The election is just, after all, 2 months away. Stephen McKinnon is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services. Lisa Raitt is the Conservative Party's Deputy Leader. Charlie Angus is the New Democrats' Ethics Critic and Vice Chair of the Ethics Committee. They all join me now from the foyer of the House of Commons over in the West Block. Hello to all 3 of you. Thanks for being with us. Really appreciate it. Mr. McKinnon, I'm going to start with you. Even if you don't accept the Ethics Commissioner's finding, why not vote to hear from him to question those conclusions?
Well, we have accepted the Ethics Commissioner's report. In fact, we've gone through now 13 hours of testimony, 10 witnesses, 5 weeks of hearings, a 63-page report that is itself the product of months and months and months of work by the Ethics Commissioner. I think there's a lot of information out there for Canadians to digest, and I think we all know what brought us here today. We're on the eve of an election, so the opposition sent their most partisan players. They came here to try and, one more time, squeeze this lemon, but I'm afraid Canadians see through those partisan games.
Could the converse be true, Mr. McKinnon, that the committee in the past has heard from former Ethics Commissioner Mary Dawson, for example, on the Prime Minister's trip to the Aga Khan's Island, but that your colleagues voted against it because the election is near?
Well, look, we didn't ask for the committee hearing today, but by the same token, the Justice Committee, as I just mentioned, had 5 weeks of hearings, 13 hours of testimony. There's a lot of information out there, and I think Canadians know that there's a lot of partisan gamesmanship going on the verge of an election, and that's why you saw this sort of influx of very partisan opposition members to come today to one more time try and play these games.
Ms. Raitt, what's your response to that, the accusation that this is partisan gamemanship, that there was 5 weeks of testimony, 13 or 5 weeks of hearings, 13 hours of testimony, lots of information, including the report out there. What more do you need to hear?
Well, and there was one act of Parliament that was broken, the Conflict of Interest Act. And, at the top, Vash, you referred to it as rules being bent or something. He broke the law. He broke the law.
Bend the will. Bend the will is the word of the Ethics Commissioner.
No, that's true of her. But you said at the beginning that this is an affair or a controversy. This is the Prime Minister who broke the law, and the Ethics Commissioner has a report. We'd like to ask the Ethics Commissioner more questions about his report because it's completely not the same thing that the Prime Minister is saying about the report. And as a result, we brought the motion, and the Liberals said no, they shut it down. And as far as saying that we're partisan, interesting word. I was there as the Vice Chair of the Justice Committee. Peter Kent was there as the Vice Chair of the Ethics Committee. We were just trying to get to the bottom of what was going on. And once again, the parliamentary members from the Liberal Party shut her down, and we don't have the ability to get any more information from the Ethics Commissioner.
Mr. Angus, what is the specific information that you're looking to get from the Ethics Commissioner? The report was lengthy, it was detailed, the conclusions are specified. What more do you need to know?
Well, I have been on the Ethics Committee for a number of years. I was there in the wildest and woolliest days of the Harper government when Dean Del Mastro was the parliamentary secretary, when Paul Calandra was the parliamentary secretary. I've seen everything, but I have never seen government interfere and obstruct the work of an officer of Parliament to report to our committee. Our committee is where the Ethics Commissioner brings his report. And what did the Liberals do today? They brought the former director of the Liberal Party. As soon as he walked in, everyone was like, oh, I wonder how this is going to go. Mr. McKinnon, former director of the Liberal Party, he's not a member of this committee. He's never showed up before. He showed up to shut this down. So why? Because there was a finding, a ruling, that the Prime Minister broke the law of Canada. The Parliament of Canada Act, or the Conflict of Interest Act, has clear obligations on the Prime Minister. He broke that. We found the evidence that his work was interfered with by the Prime Minister's office.
Are you? I just want to clarify for our viewers. Are you specifically referring to when the Ethics Commissioner says there were 9 people who had what they said was relevant information, but they couldn't put it forward because they didn't believe that they believed that it was covered by cabinet confidence and they couldn't get that waived? 9
key witnesses were prevented from presenting evidence because the Prime Minister said he didn't want any, quote, troublesome precedents. Well, of course he doesn't want something troublesome. He's under investigation for breaking the law to help very powerful people.
Is there any credence to the argument, though, that people will speak less freely around the cabinet table if that precedent is set? I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, I know, but like I'm thinking of how much they respect cabinet confidence when basically SNC was sitting under the table while Jerry Butts was strong-arming Jody Wilson-Raybould. What we've seen is how the Prime Minister's office misused the role of the Privy Council, and Mr. Wernick had to resign. There's many questions here about Mr. Trudeau being found guilty of trying to discredit, going after Jody Wilson's reputation. I would like to know more about that. I would like to know about who these witnesses were, and I'd like to know about the pattern of interference from the get-go when the Prime Minister meets with the CEO of SNC-Lavalin and sets this in motion, when Bill Morneau flies to Davos to meet with the head of SNC-Lavalin and then tells the Ethics Commissioner he can't remember what they talked about. I mean, come on, I know Mr. Morneau is really an important guy, but he flew all the way to Davos to talk with SNC just before they slipped this into the omnibus legislation. Because why is this important? It's about whether or not the super rich can write their own laws when they're facing bribery and corruption, and that's not an acceptable standard in Canada.
Mr. McKinnon, why was that? Why was the confidence not waived for those 9 people? Why is it that the government essentially stood in the way of that information coming forward?
Well, hang on a sec. Everyone, I think, cooperated very freely and fully with the Ethics Commissioner. The thing is that you do not, on an ad hoc basis, change ancient traditions, foundations of our democracy, on a whim like this.
Is that a whim? The Ethics Commissioner specifically asked the Prime Minister.
Not a whim. He's an officer of Parliament.
The fact is,
he just made this up.
The fact is that an unprecedented waiver was already granted with respect to Madam Wilson-Raybould and divulging cabinet secrets. That waiver was granted very early on in the process so as to enable full participation. But look, I think...
Just to clarify, though, the Ethics Commissioner did say that because of his inability to access all cabinet conferences related to the matter, I must, however, report that I was unable to fully discharge the investigatory duties conferred upon me by the Act. I mean, that's an officer of Parliament saying that he couldn't fully basically do his job.
That didn't prevent him from accessing any of the key players or writing after many, many months of deliberations with many, many officials, having full and free access, of writing a 63-page report that Canadians are free to consult. You know, the bottom line here is, as the Commissioner points out in his report, the motivations for the government were very clear. Were for the economic well-being of SNC, of its stakeholders, of its employees.
That's a lie. It's not in the report at all.
I'll get you both in a second, but Mr. McKinnon, he also did point out the political sort of considerations that were being put forth by the government as well, and he didn't exactly say that that was appropriate.
Well, SNC is a very important Canadian corporation. I don't think anyone can make the argument that they are not facing challenging times. They've changed their CEO. And
we're talking about politics here, right? Raising the specter of the election.
We're talking about Canadians, and we're talking about Canadians and their jobs. And I can assure you that as a Quebec MP, it was very much at the forefront of my thinking, and I know it to have been at the forefront of the thinking of all members of Cabinet, all members of the government.
Both
Mr. Angus and Ms. Wright want to jump in.
So what I'm going to say is this. This is exactly why we need to hear from the Ethics Commissioner, because Mr. McKinnon is putting words in the mouth of the Ethics Commissioner which are untrue. He's misconstruing the Ethics Commissioner's report because, quite frankly, the Ethics Commissioner found very clearly, contrary to the Prime Minister's submission, that there was impropriety and there was politically motivated. And he gave 4 instances when it happened. These are the kinds of things we need to talk about with the Ethics Commissioner so he can give the context around it instead of relying upon Liberal partisan MPs trying to, reconstitute the report and say what they think it means, not what it actually does mean.
Mr. Angus, he did highlight the impropriety, but as Mr. McKinnon said, he did also detail the sort of motivation insofar as saving those jobs goes, correct?
Well, actually, Mr. Morneau provided no evidence to the Commissioner to back up these claims. The Prime Minister was recorded, and the Ethics Commissioner noted that he was saying, hey, I'm the MP for Papineau. This showed why the Prime Minister had a direct personal interest in this. But I think Mr. McKinnon has pretty much laid out the case, and I can't do a better job than him. He is the former director of the Liberal Party. He has just said that the work of the Ethics Commissioner, whose job it is to hold all parliamentarians to account, was acting on an ad hoc basis and on a whim of following the rule of law in Canada. I think Mr. McKinnon's very clear on this, because for the Liberals, they don't believe the Prime Minister has to obey the law when it comes to their rich friends. They believe they can interfere in the rule of law, and this is what he was found guilty of by the Ethics Commissioner. So, of course, they don't believe the Ethics Commissioner should even have the right to appear before the committee, and their disrespect for the committee is shown by the fact that they send a guy like Mr. McKinnon, the former director of the party, to show up and shut down work that we've done on a nonpartisan basis for 4 years. If they don't believe in the rule of law, then we have a real problem in this country. If they don't believe in the issue of the independence of the prosecution service, then we have a real problem.
What's important for Canadians to understand is that a very serious exercise led by Anne McClellan has been undertaken. To all former
I think they're
attorneys
questioning
general.
Mr. Kinnon, why you were there instead of the other members of the actual committee.
We can go through my curriculum vitae. I was national director of the Liberal Party for 3 years, 15 years ago, and I've had a private sector career since then. I don't know what Mr. Angus is getting at.
What are you talking about, Anne McClellan? We're talking about Dion.
Okay, I gotta go. I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but I appreciate it.
This is why we need more discussion on it, Jackie. This is it.
Thank you very much to all three of you for your time this evening.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to Steve McKinnon, Lisa Wright, and Charlie Angus.
The Prime Minister's MPs across the way will decide whether, after silencing Jody Wilson-Raybould, they will silence the Ethics Commissioner as well. Whether they will vote to ban the Ethics Commissioner from appearing at the Ethics Committee.
He has to report to us. This is his job. Any attempt by the Liberals to stop that will be a pattern of continuing the interference and the obstruction in the fundamental principles of the parliamentary system.
Something was really wrong here. Something's deeply wrong here. And I beg my friends around the table to allow Monsieur Dion to speak to us.
Opposition seeks to prolong this process for reasons of politics, reasons of partisan games, and it is for that reason, Mr. Chair, that we will be opposing this motion.
Mr. Kent's motion is defeated.
The Liberal majority of the Ethics Committee voted down opposition motions to hold more hearings into the SNC-Lavalin affair. That's following a report from the Ethics Commissioner last week. Lone Liberal MP Nathaniel Erskine-Smith voted with the opposition, but that wasn't enough to force the appearance of Commissioner Mario Dion. Dion found that the Prime Minister broke the ethics rules by attempting to, quote, bend the will of former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould in SNC-Lavalin's favor. But Wilson-Raybould has said she doesn't believe anything illegal took place. So is a further investigation needed? Have Canadians already made up their minds on this issue? Time for the Power Panel. Sally Hauser is a political commentator who has worked on NDP campaigns. She joins us from Regina. In Toronto, Omar Khan is Vice President of Public Affairs with Hill & Knowlton Strategies. And here with me in Ottawa, Tim Powers is the Vice Chair of Summa Strategies. Hi, everybody. Hello. So we have talked at length on the show about the veracity of claims and the debate that took place, Tim, in the committee and in the committee in the past. But what about the politics behind it? Because we just had an interesting hit from Eric that showed that the needle hasn't moved immediately following the release of that report. What does that mean for political parties in the way that they approach this?
Well, they still, obviously, as you saw, Steve McKinnon's quote, Steve's a friend, he's doing what he's supposed to do and saying, no, this is the opposition playing politics, because God forbid we hear from the Ethics Commissioner. Canadians are tired of that. Liberals want to stop it. The NDP, the Conservatives, and the Greens, it appears, want to continue the debate. Stepping back from the politics, if that's at all possible at this moment, I think there's probably enough Canadians, even some Liberals, who wouldn't have minded hearing from Commissioner Dion. I think that maybe is a bit of a small miscalculation by the Liberals. You'll remember they originally tried to stop Jody Wilson-Raybould and others from testifying. The story tomorrow will be, or it already is, I should say, and in the continuous cycle that they've done that. The Liberal strategy was if Dion had come forward, new information, new questions, that would have led to more questions. By stopping it now, they take the one-day hit. I don't think the Conservatives are going to give up on this, or are the NDP. So we'll see in another few days if there's any any more movement on this. I think, though, as you saw with Andrew Scheer yesterday, though he did write that letter to the RCMP, he's signaling a recognition by talking about fiscal policy and some of the tax credits he was announcing yesterday, that he recognizes that in and of itself, going on this issue alone will not be enough for him to win the election.
What do you think, Omar? I mean, the ethics commissioner the previous one did a report, appeared before the ethics committee. This one obviously was blocked from doing so.
Well, God forbid politicians play politics 3 or 4 weeks before the start of a general election campaign. For sure, there's an element of politics here, probably on both sides, but particularly, on the side of the opposition. Look, that's what opposition parties do. They want to keep this in. They clearly want to keep this story alive and in the news cycle as long as they can. And God bless them. That's, again, like I said, every opposition party will do this, and that's what they're going to do. It's not really working for them, though. So if I was advising, far be it from me to advise Mr. Scheer or Mr. Singh, but if I were advising them, I would take a bit of a different track right now, as we've noted earlier. The poll numbers aren't moving, and particularly they're not moving in Ontario and Quebec. And in this country, if you're coming out of a general election with 100 to 110, even 120 seats out of those two provinces, it's pretty much the ball game.
Sally?
What I find interesting in this is, and I found the kind of, the dial not being moved fascinating, but, we're kind of running out of runway in a way. I think the opposition's right to keep poking at this. The ethics commissioner testifies, it's problematic for the Liberals. He doesn't, it's problematic for the Liberals. This is a crisis of the Liberals' own making that's been mishandled from the very, very get-go. It's a strong issue for the opposition, particularly for the NDP. Charlie Angus, I think, has been on every ethical scandal that the Conservatives and Liberals have been able to put out there over the past kind of 10 years. But where I think this is going to be more problematic for the Liberals is that greater tone of, people might not understand all the kind of ins and outs and the specifics, but it's that larger tone, that impression of a government that's just out there for their buddies in corporate Canada or international corporations, who's just in it for their friends, not for the public, not trustworthy. Those greater narratives, those are really problematic. And during an election campaign, that's where they become very amplified in terms of advertising. I don't think any political party is going to try to explain the whole thing in political ads. They're going to, narrow it down, condense it to its biggest message, which is you can't trust this guy. He's not in it for you.
But the message, they put that message out for a while, Tim, and maybe there are Canadians that are buying into it for sure, but are they then turning away from Justin Trudeau to other parties because the polls aren't necessarily showing that?
Well, it's the first sampling, as Eric pointed out, I think, as he said to you, in the last go-around, which I think was more dramatic, obviously, because you had the human dimension of Jody Wilson-Raybould calling out
and it wasn't the dead of August.
And it wasn't the dead of August. There are some other pollsters who've said there are other indicators that there's some movement there around trust and electability, those numbers being down for the Prime Minister. But as I say, you're not going to win the election on this if you're Jagmeet Singh or you're Andrew Scheer or you're Elizabeth May. It has to be about affordability. But I wonder if the Liberals made a bit of another mistake there today, Vashi, when they had Anita van de Velde there. She, of course, was one of the Liberal members who voted today. She'd previously been sanctioned by the Ethics Commissioner. I'm not sure how legitimate it was for somebody who has arguably a history with the Ethics Commissioner come in and say, I don't want to hear from him. It's small things like that in their communications rollout before they've got in trouble. That's not going to be an issue that's going to change the dynamic of the election, but it makes it harder for Omar and others who are passionate about the Liberal Party to come out and say there's nothing to see here, there's nothing to do here, because the Liberals are, of course, covering their butt here, because the greatest vulnerability for the Liberal Party, and I think even Omar would agree with this, is if Canadians sense they're, the old David Dingwald line, they're entitled to their entitlements and their self-interest rules above all. So Liberals do have to manage that. That's why they want this to go away.
Do you agree with that, Omar?
Look, I think having the Prime Minister out there on the trail, particularly in Quebec, talking about how, his number one priority was trying to find some solution to protect thousands of workers across this country, particularly in the province of Quebec, I think that's a defensible position. For sure, things could have been done differently. And look, we've heard from the Ethics Commissioner. There's like 63-page report out there. But I think what Canadians really want to hear right now is, what are you going to do for the middle class? What's your policy for healthcare? What's your policy for pharmacare? What's your policy to keep growing the economy, an economy that's been growing at a record pace with record low unemployment? But what's your plan for the future to make sure the kids who are graduating from college and trades and universities right now
Can't Canadians
have the
ask all
ability
those
to get
questions?
a job?
Can't they ask all those questions of their leaders and hope that they're ethical as well?
Absolutely, and I think that, and as I said, I think having the Prime Minister and his team out there talking about how, yes, perhaps mistakes were made, and they've said this, perhaps things could have been done differently, but the underlying intent behind everything was to protect middle-class jobs, and that's the number one focus of this government.
And you know what, the insistence has sort of that, and I would say, Sally, and I don't know if you agree, but over the past week since the release of this report, the Prime Minister has definitely apologized, especially in the last few days, almost like softened the tone a bit, but very much continued to insist that this was about saving jobs. And it would appear, if you look at the polls, and I'm not saying that they're the be-all, end-all, but that message has resonated to a certain degree.
I mean, I think it's all they've got when you're trying to defend this breach of the public trust, which is really what it is. I think when you look through that ethics report, it becomes pretty clear that this wasn't about jobs. This is about buddies and wealthy donors, and frankly, interfering.
You don't think if
in the
those
democratic
jobs?
process.
You don't think if those thousands of? But one second, Omar. You don't think if those thousands of jobs had been cut, that there wouldn't be?
But where was the proof that there were those
jobs?
There weren't. But look what's happened to SNC in the meantime.
Going to happen. Like I said, hey, I don't blame the Liberals for taking this line. I would do the same thing if I were there, because it's all that they have. So whether that resonates, it probably does, particularly in Quebec. But going back to the advertising and elections, I think this election coming up, that nobody's really excited to vote for Justin Trudeau like perhaps they were in the past, and that's when really kind of targeted advertising on this issue and others can make that difference once the writ actually drops.
I was just going to say, but this jobs thing, I think has been well pointed out. There was no evidence to all of that, and you're asking about, look at what's happened to SNC. What's happened to SNC? Crappy corporate governance and apparent corruption. SNC leadership of the past, and perhaps some that is still there, created this problem. So Sally's entirely right. Justin Trudeau's trying to say, never mind that, this company is too big to fail. Well, the company leadership has to be held to account there. And even Neil Bruce, the CEO, said there is no suggestion that they were going to knock off 9,000 jobs, and they had just signed a deal with Casta Depot to 2026 to properly fund their
But you can imagine, okay.
But there were jobs
I agree with you. There was no, and many times I've asked Liberal MPs, where's the evidence? But think about a company employing that many people who cannot then bid on any federal projects for 10 years. I mean, that's going to have an impact to their bottom line.
There was definitely going to be an impact to the bottom line. And look, 100%, there needs to be accountability. There's a criminal process, there's criminal prosecution underway right now. But I think what was at the crux of this, and this is evident if you look through the testimony and even the secret recording that Jody Wilson-Raybould released, the underlying motivation was to try and find ways to protect and secure as many of those jobs as possible, because you know what? None of those workers who are on the front lines over there had anything to do with any of the allegations.
But it wasn't the workers
that are
who were in the
faced.
Minister of Finance's office telling the government how to put this in.
You can't break the rules on a
budget
hypothetical
bill, right?
like that.
Okay, I gotta go though. I'm out of time. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.